The Bible records every parable Jesus told, every miracle he performed, every word he said on the cross. But there is one single moment when he writes something, and the text simply doesn't say what. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a copyist's error. The Gospel of John chose to keep silent about the words that the finger of God traced in the dust of Jerusalem, and that silence has lasted 2,000 years. The episode is recorded in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. It is one of the most well-known passages in the New Testament. Preachers quote it, films reproduce it, artists paint it, but when you read the text with surgical attention, you notice something disturbing. The Gospel describes Jesus writing on the ground twice. Twice the finger touches the ground, and in neither instance does the text mention a single word of what was written. The omission is not accidental. John is the same author who records the exact number of fish in a net, 153. The same one who preserves extensive theological dialogues, details of scenery, names of obscure villages, and precisely at the moment when Jesus writes something with his own finger, the Gospel falls silent. Why? To understand the weight of this scene, you first need to understand where it takes place and when. We are in the Temple of Jerusalem, not just any provincial temple, but the absolute center of the Jewish religion, the most sacred place on earth for any Jew of the first century. Herod the Great had invested 46 years reforming and expanding that complex. White limestone stones gleamed under the Judean sun. Marble columns supported enormous porticos. Gold covered parts of the facade. The historian Josephus wrote that anyone looking at the temple from afar needed to avert their eyes. The reflection of the sun on the gold and white stone was too dazzling. The courtyard where Jesus was teaching was probably the court of the Gentiles, the outer area of the complex. It was the only place where non-Jews could enter. It was also where the temple commerce took place, the sale of animals for sacrifice, the exchange of foreign coins for temple coins. The noise was constant. Shouts of merchants announcing doves and lambs, bleating of animals waiting for buyers, coins clinking on the tables of the money changers. Discussions about prices, pilgrims from all parts of the Roman world circulating, speaking dozens of different languages. And in the midst of that controlled confusion, Jesus was teaching. The text says, he was seated. In the rabbinic culture of the first century, sitting to teach indicated formal authority. The master sat, the disciples stood or sat around him in a semicircle of attention. Jesus was not simply having an informal conversation, he was exercising the function of a rabbi, a recognized teacher. And this deeply disturbed the religious leaders of Jerusalem. The Gospel of John makes it clear that at that point in Jesus' public ministry, the decision had already been made behind the scenes of religious power. That man from Galilee needed to be eliminated, not because he was a heretic, although that would be the official accusation they would use, but because he was gaining followers too quickly, because he challenged the established authority, because he performed miracles they could neither explain nor deny, because common people listened to his words and said, "No man ever spoke like this." The problem was how to eliminate Jesus without losing popular support. The crowd that followed him was too large to be ignored, and the timing was dangerous. Only a few days remained until Passover, when Jerusalem would be packed with pilgrims from all over the Jewish world. Any violent action against a charismatic leader could generate revolt. Rome did not tolerate revolts, and if Rome intervened, the religious leaders would lose the little power they still had. They needed a way to destroy Jesus' reputation using his own words against him. And that's when the perfect opportunity arose. The Gospel says that scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. The Greek word used is autophoro, literally, in the very act. It was not an accusation based on rumors or second-hand testimony. They claimed flagrant evidence, eyewitnesses who saw the exact moment of the forbidden relationship. Now stop and think about the logistics required for this to happen. To catch someone in the very act of adultery, you need to know where the person will be. You need to know when they will be there. You need to know with whom they will be. You need to have access to the location, probably a private house, a closed room. You need to coordinate at least 2 witnesses, because Jewish law required 2 or 3 testimonies for capital condemnation. And you need to do all this at the exact moment, neither before nor after. This doesn't happen by chance. Some biblical scholars suggest that the situation itself was fabricated, that the Pharisees knew about the affair, monitored the woman, perhaps even facilitated the encounter, and then deliberately invaded to create the scene they wanted. The woman was not merely caught. She was used as bait in a trap that had another target. If this is true, the cruelty of the episode takes on an even darker dimension. Those men were willing to use a woman's life and potentially destroy it just to create an embarrassing situation for Jesus. And the man involved in the adultery? He disappeared. The law of Moses is clear about this. Leviticus 20, verse 10. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Deuteronomy 22, verses 22 through 24, repeats the same requirement. Both must die, man and woman, but only she was dragged to the temple. Only she was thrown into the middle of the courtyard. Only she had to hear the public accusation while a crowd watched. Only she was left exposed, humiliated, waiting for stones. Where was he? The text doesn't answer, but the absence of the man reveals something crucial about who was behind this. Those Pharisees didn't want justice. If they did, they would have brought both. They wanted a trap. And the woman was merely the disposable instrument. The question they asked Jesus was calculated with surgical precision. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Moses, in the law, commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? Notice the rhetorical structure. First, they called Jesus teacher. It was a title of respect, recognition of rabbinic authority. By using it, they placed on Jesus the formal responsibility of issuing a legal opinion. It was not casual conversation. It was an official consultation with a recognized master. Second, they cite Moses, not just any source, but the supreme authority of Jewish tradition, the law given by God at Sinai, inviolable, sacred. To question Moses was to question God himself. Third, they established the precedent. Moses commanded us to stone. They leave no room for alternative interpretation. The verdict has already been given by tradition. And finally, the trap closes. What do you say? The question forced a binary response. If Jesus said, stone her, he would be contradicting everything he preached. 3 years of public ministry speaking about mercy, forgiveness, love for sinners. He ate with tax collectors. He touched lepers. He forgave prostitutes. How could he now order a woman killed for adultery? He would immediately lose the support of the crowds who followed him precisely because of his message of radical grace. And there was another problem. Rome. Judea was occupied territory. The Romans allowed the Jews to maintain their religious laws and internal courts, but with one crucial exception, the death penalty. Only the Roman governor had authority to order execution. That's why, weeks later, the same religious leaders would have to take Jesus to Pilate. They had no legal power to kill him on their own. If Jesus ordered the woman stoned right there, he would not only be contradicting his own message, but also defying Roman authority. The Pharisees could report him to the governor as an instigator of illegal execution, but the other option was equally fatal. If Jesus said, "Don't stone her," he would be publicly rejecting the law of Moses. He would be saying before witnesses that the Torah was wrong, that God had ordered something unjust. That would be blasphemy, a crime punishable by death under Jewish law itself. The Pharisees would have exactly the ammunition they needed. They could formally accuse him before the Sanhedrin. They could say, he rejects Moses, he contradicts the law, he blasphemes against divine ordinances. There was no way out. Any direct answer would destroy Jesus. The trap was perfect, and then something happened that no one expected. Jesus did not respond. The text of John 8 verse 6 simply says, "But Jesus, bending down, wrote on the ground with his finger." Silence. The man who always had an answer for everything. The rabbi who had debated with doctors of the law since he was 12 years old. The teacher who answered tricky questions with brilliant parables. That man simply bent down and began to trace something on the dusty ground of the temple courtyard. Try to visualize the scene. The Pharisees standing, forming an accusatory semicircle. Formal robes, phylacteries tied on their arms and foreheads, ritual fringes visible. Faces of anticipated triumph. They had finally cornered the Galilean, the woman in the center of the circle, probably with clothes in disarray, hastily pulled from where she had been, perhaps crying, perhaps in shock, perhaps simply waiting for the death she knew was inevitable. Around her, men with stones already in their hands. The law allowed the witnesses of the crime to throw the first stones, the crowd in tense silence, seconds before they had been listening to teachings about the kingdom of God. Now they were witnessing a trial of life or death. And Jesus crouched on the ground, apparently ignoring everyone, drawing something in the dust with his finger. The gesture was so unexpected, so outside protocol, that the accusers didn't know how to react. They kept asking. The Greek text uses the verb in the imperfect tense, indicating repeated and continuous action. They didn't ask once and wait. They asked several times. They insisted. They pressed. They demanded an answer. And Jesus kept writing. What did he write? Here begins the mystery that 20 centuries of Christianity have not been able to solve. The first theory, and the most popular throughout church history, suggests that Jesus wrote the sins of the accusers. The idea appears in ancient Christian texts, though not in the most reliable biblical manuscripts. Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century, mentions a version of the story in which Jesus wrote the sins of each accuser in the sand. The tradition gained strength because it would perfectly explain the reaction described in the text. The Pharisees leaving one by one, starting with the oldest. If Jesus were publicly exposing secret sins, hidden adulteries, financial dishonesties, lies, hypocrisies, the shame would be unbearable. Each man who saw his own sin written on the ground would prefer to flee rather than remain there. But there is a serious problem with this theory. If Jesus had demonstrated supernatural knowledge of those men's secret sins, it would be an extraordinary miracle. And John does not hesitate to record miracles. The entire gospel is structured around 7 miraculous signs that prove the divinity of Jesus. Why would he omit precisely this one? Furthermore, in other passages where Jesus demonstrates knowing people's inner selves, the text explicitly mentions it. With the Samaritan woman, Jesus said, "You have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." John recorded the complete sentence. Why would it be different here? The second theory points to a specific verse from the Old Testament that may be the key to everything. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 13 contains a rare expression loaded with meaning. "Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from me will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." Written in the dust. In Jewish tradition, being written carried enormous weight. The Book of Life, mentioned in Exodus and the Psalms, contained the names of the righteous whom God would preserve. Having one's name written in that heavenly book was a guarantee of eternal life. But being written in the dust was the exact opposite. Transience, judgment, oblivion, names written in dust are erased by the first wind. If Jesus quoted Jeremiah, or simply wrote the words written in the dust, the Pharisees, who knew the scriptures by heart, would have understood immediately. They, who considered themselves guardians of the law and models of piety, were being compared to those who forsake the Lord. The accusation was devastating precisely because it was silent. But again, the question arises, why would John omit such a powerful prophetic quotation? The third theory is simpler and perhaps more disturbing in its simplicity. Perhaps Jesus didn't write anything specific. Some scholars suggest that the gesture of writing on the ground was simply a deliberate pause, a refusal to participate in the accuser's game. Instead of responding in the heat of the moment, falling into the prepared trap, Jesus introduced silence and time. In first-century rabbinic debates, there was a recognized technique. When confronted with a trap question, the sage could use silence as a response. Not answering was already answering. It showed that the question did not deserve the dignity of a direct response. If Jesus was simply tracing lines in the dust, meaningless drawings, random scribbles, the gesture itself was already the message. It said, without words, "This trap is not worthy of my attention. You do not deserve an answer." But there is a linguistic problem with this theory. The Greek verb used in the text, katagrapho, does not simply mean to draw or to scribble. It means to write, usually something specific with content. John chose that word deliberately. There is yet a fourth theory, less known in the Protestant world, but fascinating from a historical legal point of view. In the Roman legal system that governed Judea in the 1st century, judges had a formal procedure for issuing sentences. Before pronouncing the verdict aloud, they wrote it down. The sentence was first recorded, then read publicly. It was a solemn act that formalized the judicial decision. If Jesus was imitating this procedure, ritually assuming the role of judge and writing a sentence before pronouncing it, the gesture would take on a completely different meaning. He would not be evading the question. He would be responding more deeply than the accusers imagined. And the sentence he wrote would not be against the woman. It would be against them. Jesus' silence lasted long enough for the tension to become unbearable. Then he stood up and said only one sentence. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." 14 words in English, even fewer in the original Greek, a single sentence that completely demolished the trap. They had prepared for days, perhaps weeks. Notice what Jesus did. He didn't say the law was wrong. He didn't say adultery was acceptable. He didn't say the woman was innocent. He didn't contradict Moses in a single word. He simply added a requirement that the law itself already presupposed. Deuteronomy 17 verses 6 and 7 established that the witnesses of a capital crime should be the first to execute the sentence. But there was an implicit condition in the entire Jewish legal system. The witnesses needed to be people of integrity. Testimony from a person with a tainted reputation had no value. Jesus was not inventing a new rule. He was applying an already existing principle in a way that no one had thought of before. And immediately after speaking, he went back to writing on the ground. Second time, the same mysterious gesture, more words, or the same ones, traced in the dust, while the accusers processed what they had just heard. The effect was devastating. The text says they went away one by one, beginning with the oldest down to the last. The order is significant. The oldest left first. Why? Several explanations are possible. They had more years of life, therefore more accumulated sins. They had more wisdom, therefore more capacity to recognize when a battle was lost. They had more reputation to lose, therefore more to risk if they stayed. Or perhaps they were simply the ones closest to Jesus when he wrote, the ones who saw first what was on the ground. Think about the psychological dynamic of that moment. The Pharisees came prepared to win. They had the law on their side. They had witnesses. They had the woman as living proof. They had stones in their hands. They had absolute certainty that Jesus had no way out, and in less than a minute everything collapsed. None of them argued. None said, "But the law demands." None tried to debate. None insisted on the execution. They simply dropped the stones and left, one by one, in silence. This is not normal behavior for people who believe they are right. People convinced of their position argue, defend, insist. They don't flee in shame. What did Jesus write that transformed determined accusers into men who couldn't even maintain eye contact? The mystery remains. When all the accusers had left, Jesus stood up again. The text describes a scene that would be almost comical if it weren't so profound. Jesus looks around, the courtyard empty of accusers, the stones abandoned on the ground, the crowd still present, but now in stunned silence, and asks the woman, "Where are those who accused you? Has no one condemned you?" The question is rhetorical. Jesus knew perfectly well that everyone had left, but he wanted her to say it herself. He wanted her to hear the words coming from her own mouth. "No one, Lord." And then came the phrase that would echo for 2 millennia. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Notice what is present and what is absent in this declaration. Present, acknowledgement of sin. Jesus did not say, "You did nothing wrong." He said, "Sin no more," which presupposes that there was sin. The woman was guilty. The adultery happened. Present, offer of forgiveness. "Neither do I condemn you." The only one who had moral authority to condemn, the only one without sin in that courtyard, chose not to. Present, call to transformation. Go and sin no more. Forgiveness was not a license to continue in error. It was a new chance with expectation of change. Absent, public humiliation. Jesus did not deliver a sermon on the evils of adultery. He did not demand detailed confession. He did not impose visible penance. Mercy came in privacy, or as close to privacy as possible, given that the crowd was still watching from a distance. And the words written on the ground, the wind of Jerusalem was already taking care of them, dust upon dust. Letters becoming undefined lines, then smudges, then nothing. Whatever Jesus wrote disappeared that very day, but the effect remained. There is a technical detail about this passage that most readers are completely unaware of. And this detail adds another layer of mystery to the story. The passage barely exists in the ancient manuscripts. The oldest documents we have of the Gospel of John, Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 75, both copied around the year 200, do not contain this story. They simply skip from John 7, verse 52, directly to John 8, verse 12. The Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, two of the most important and complete manuscripts of the New Testament, dated to the 4th century, also omit the entire passage. Other manuscripts place the story in different locations. Some position it after John 7, verse 36. Others after John 21, verse 25. And some manuscripts include the story not in John, but in Luke, after chapter 21. Several ancient copyists marked the passage with asterisks or obeli, signs indicating doubt about the authenticity of the text. What does this mean? It means that the story of the adulterous woman probably circulated orally in Christian communities for decades, perhaps almost a century, before being incorporated into the written manuscripts of the Gospel. And when it was finally included, the copyists didn't know exactly where it belonged in the narrative. But here is the crucial point. Even with all this textual uncertainty, the passage was preserved. The early church, the same Christians who were meticulous in preserving the integrity of the scriptures, considered this story too important to be lost, too true to be discarded, too authentic to be ignored. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, offered an explanation for the omission in some manuscripts. He suggested that certain scribes deliberately removed the passage for fear it would be misinterpreted. If Jesus forgave an adulteress without demanding punishment, they argued, women might use it as an excuse for infidelity. The story would be dangerous for public morality. Whatever the reason for the irregular transmission, the result is that we have a story that the early church fought to preserve, but whose central detail remains hidden. What did Jesus write? The question has crossed centuries. Church fathers speculated, medieval theologians debated, Protestant reformers analyzed, modern scholars investigated with all the tools of textual criticism, and no one knows. Perhaps that is precisely the point. Think about the narrative, structure of the episode. What really matters in the story is not the content of the words on the ground. It is the effect they caused. Accusers left. A certain condemnation was cancelled. Stones prepared to kill were abandoned on the ground. A woman who should have been dead walked away alive. Mercy triumphed over legalism. Grace defeated the trap. If we knew exactly what Jesus wrote, the focus would inevitably shift. We would discuss whether the Jeremiah quotation was correct. We would analyze whether the sins listed were proportional to the gravity of adultery. We would debate the theological handwriting of the Son of God. We would create doctrines based on words that were erased by the wind hours after being written. And we would miss what really matters. The mystery preserves the message. The silence of the text is pedagogical. It forces you, reader from 2,000 years later, to look not at the dust, but at what happened around it. There is a rabbinic tradition that says, when a sage refuses to answer, the refusal is already the answer. Jesus did not respond to the Pharisees with words. He responded with silence, dust, and a finger tracing, something we will never know. And that non-response was more devastating than any argument he could have constructed. The accusers wanted a theological debate. They received a mirror. Today, the floor of the temple courtyard no longer exists. The stones that built that place were torn down in the year 70 after Christ, when Roman legions under the command of Titus razed Jerusalem. The dust where Jesus wrote became part of other constructions, other centuries, other histories. It mixed with the blood of wars, with the ashes of destructions, with the footsteps of pilgrims from dozens of different religions. But the question remains, what did he write? And perhaps the question is more important than the answer.